You know that feeling when something really simple brings back the best memories? For me, it was my grandmother's porch swing. Every summer evening, we'd sit there together, watching the sunset, drinking sweet tea and sharing stories about her. Childhood, that old wooden swing meant everything to me. So when I finally bought my own house in Hampton Falls last year, the first thing I did was install a beautiful hardwood porch swing, just like my grandmother's. Little did I know that this simple piece of furniture would trigger a bizarre power struggle with the most controlling HOA president I've ever met. Before I get into the crazy situation that unfolded, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story ends. I'm Jennifer Mitchell, but everyone calls me Jenny. When I first moved into Maple Ridge Estates, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood had that classic suburban charm, tree-lined streets, well-maintained gardens, and friendly neighbors who actually waved when you drove past. After years of apartment living, I was finally ready to put down roots in a place I could call my own. The house I bought wasn't the biggest or the fanciest in the neighborhood, but it had character. A beautiful craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch that practically begged for a swing. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 30 years, and they'd maintained it beautifully. The moment I walked through the front door, I knew this was where I wanted to build my life. The closing process went smoothly, and I was aware the neighborhood had an HOA. The real estate agent, Emily Watson, assured me they were reasonable. Just basic rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and holiday decorations. Nothing that seemed too restrictive. I'd read through the HOA guidelines carefully before signing, and there wasn't a single mention of porch furniture being regulated. My first few weeks in the house were spent unpacking, painting, and making it feel like home. Pete and Carol Anderson, the elderly couple next door, brought over a homemade apple pie to welcome me. They reminded me so much of my grandparents. Warm, genuine people who'd been in the neighborhood since it was built. "You know what this porch needs?" Carol had said during one of our chats. "A nice swing. It would look perfect right there." She pointed to the corner of the porch that overlooked my small front garden. That comment was all the encouragement I needed. I'd already been thinking about it, and the next weekend I hired Mike Roberts, a local handyman recommended by the Andersons, to install the swing. I'd found the perfect one, a gorgeous 5-foot hardwood swing with a dark walnut finish. Mike did an incredible job with the installation, making sure everything was secure and properly balanced. "This'll last you decades if you take care of it," he'd said, giving it a test swing. Solid craftsmanship, just like they used to make. That swing quickly became my favorite spot. Every evening after work, I'd sit there with a book or just watch the world go by, just like I used to do with my grandmother. Sarah Chen, a young mum from across the street, would often walk by with her 2 little girls, and they'd wave excitedly. Sometimes they'd stop to chat, and the girls would ask for a gentle push on the swing. "This is just what the neighborhood needed," Sarah had commented one evening. "Reminds me of the houses I used to see in old movies, so welcoming and homey." For the first month, everything was perfect. The swing became a natural gathering spot. Pete and Carol would sometimes join me for evening conversations. Other neighbors would stop by to introduce themselves. It felt like I was building exactly the kind of community I'd hoped for when I bought the house. Then came the day I met Rebecca Thompson, though everyone called her Becky. She was the HOA president, and from the moment she walked up my front path, something felt off. She had that kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and she carried herself with an air of authority that seemed forced. "Hi there," she called out as she approached. "I'm Becky Thompson, president of the Maple Ridge Estates HOA. I noticed you've made some changes to your front porch." I was sitting on the swing at the time, enjoying my Saturday morning coffee. "Nice to meet you, Becky. I'm Jenny Mitchell. Would you like to join me? The swing's really comfortable." Her smile tightened slightly. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. We've had some concerns about the swing. It's a bit rustic for our neighborhood aesthetic. Several board members have mentioned it makes the surrounding properties look less upscale by comparison. I blinked in surprise. The swing was brand new, expertly crafted, and perfectly maintained. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. The swing is well made and matches the style of the house perfectly. Plus, there's nothing in the HOA guidelines about porch furniture. Becky's smile never wavered, but her voice took on a condescending tone. Well, yes, but we do have general guidelines about maintaining property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Porch swings tend to give off a rather country feel. This is an upscale suburban community, not a farmhouse. I felt my grandmother's voice in my head, telling me to stand my ground but stay polite. I appreciate your concern, Becky, but I've reviewed all the HOA documentation thoroughly. There are no restrictions on porch furniture, and this swing is a high-quality addition to my home. Several neighbors have actually commented on how much they like it. Oh, I'm sure some people might find it charming, she said, making the word sound like anything but a compliment. But as HOA president, I have to think about the bigger picture. We're trying to maintain a certain standard here. Perhaps you could consider a more modern seating option. Some nice Adirondack chairs, maybe? I took a deep breath, remembering all the summer evenings spent on my grandmother's swing. I understand you're trying to do your job, Becky, but this swing stays. It's completely within HOA guidelines. It's well maintained and it's important to me. She straightened up, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to discuss this at the next board meeting then. We might need to implement some new guidelines about porch furniture for the good of the community, you understand. As she walked away, I had a sinking feeling this wouldn't be the last I heard about my porch swing. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything, taking pictures of the swing, writing down our conversation, and making note of the date and time. Something told me I'd need this documentation later. This story is just getting started, and believe me, it gets much crazier from here. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to catch the next part where things really start heating up. Leave a comment below sharing your own HOA stories. I'd love to hear if anyone else has dealt with something similar. 3 days after Becky's first visit, I was enjoying my morning coffee on the swing when I noticed a small group of people walking through the neighborhood. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maple Ridge Estates was the kind of place where people often took morning walks. But as they got closer, I recognized Becky leading what appeared to be an unofficial HOA inspection tour. With her were Greg Wilson, the HOA vice president, and Diana Cooper, the secretary. They were carrying clipboards and stopping at various houses, making notes and taking pictures. I watched as they made their way down Cedar Street, pausing in front of each house. When they reached mine, they spent considerably more time than they had at other properties. Greg was pointing at various aspects of my porch, while Becky nodded emphatically, scribbling something on her clipboard. Diana looked uncomfortable, glancing between her colleagues and my house with a worried expression. I decided to be proactive. Setting down my coffee cup, I walked to the edge of my porch. Good morning. Would any of you like to come up and actually try the swing? It's much more comfortable than it looks from down there. Becky's head snapped up, clearly surprised to find me watching them. She recovered quickly, plastering on that same artificial smile I was beginning to know all too well. Oh, Jenny, how nice to see you. We're just conducting our monthly property review, standard procedure, you understand. I maintained a friendly tone, even as I noticed Greg taking photos of my porch. I'd love to hear more about this monthly review process. I don't remember seeing anything about it in the HOA documentation. Is this a new initiative? Diana shifted uncomfortably, but Becky jumped in before she could speak. We're implementing some new procedures to ensure our community maintains its premium status. Property values are very important to all of us, aren't they? I nodded, keeping my voice steady. They certainly are. That's why I invested in such a high-quality porch swing. You know, my neighbor Sarah Chen mentioned just yesterday how it reminds her of those classic American homes that hold their value so well. Greg lowered his camera, looking slightly uncertain, but Becky wasn't deterred. Speaking of the swing, Jenny, have you had time to reconsider our discussion about more appropriate porch furniture? There's nothing to reconsider, Becky. The swing stays. I made sure to maintain eye contact as I spoke, but I am curious about these photos you're taking. Could you tell me more about how they'll be used? Greg at least had the decency to look embarrassed, but Becky waved her hand dismissively.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Just documentation for our records. We photograph all properties during our reviews, though I must say that swing does stand out rather prominently in the photos. I pulled out my phone and started recording video, making sure to capture their continued photography of my property. Well, since we're all documenting things, I hope you don't mind if I keep a record as well, for the sake of transparency. That got their attention. Diana actually took a step back while Greg lowered his camera completely. Only Becky maintained her composure, though I noticed her smile had become somewhat fixed. There's really no need for that, Jenny. We're just doing our jobs as HOA board members, looking out for everyone's interests. I completely understand, I replied, still recording. And I'm just looking out for mine. By the way, would you mind sharing a copy of the official HOA policy regarding these property reviews? I'd love to better understand the process. Becky's smile tightened even further. We'll be discussing all procedures at the next HOA meeting. You should come. It's next Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. We have some important new guidelines to propose. As they walked away, I noticed Diana glancing back at me with what looked like sympathy. I had a feeling the next HOA meeting was going to be interesting, to say the least. Later that afternoon, Pete and Carol Anderson came over for our usual weekend chat. They'd witnessed the morning's inspection from their porch and were concerned. "We've lived here for 20 years, Pete said, settling into one of my porch chairs, while Carol took a seat on the swing. "Never seen anything like these property reviews before. Becky's been going a bit power crazy since she became president last year." Carol nodded in agreement. "It started with small things, the color of mailboxes, the height of garden gnomes, silly stuff really. But lately she's been getting more aggressive about it. Last month, she tried to tell the Bakers they couldn't park their minivan in their own driveway because it degraded the neighborhood's luxury appeal. This was news to me. What happened with that?" "Tim Baker stood his ground," Pete chuckled. "Pointed out that nowhere in the HOA guidelines does it restrict what kind of personal vehicles residents can own." Becky backed down, but she wasn't happy about it. "And now she's set her sights on your swing," Carol added, giving it a gentle push. "Though I can't imagine why. It's beautiful, and everyone loves it. Sarah's girls were just telling me yesterday how much they enjoy stopping by to see you." I shared with them my growing concerns about Becky's behavior and showed them the video I'd taken that morning. Pete's expression grew serious as he watched. "Smart thinking, documenting everything," he said. "I've got a feeling you might need it. Becky tends to be creative with her interpretation of HOA rules when she wants something." Carol reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I've actually been keeping track of some of Becky's more questionable actions since she became president. Just dates, incidents, that sort of thing. Something felt off about how she was running things. Would you like to see it?" I spent the next hour going through Carol's notebook. She had meticulously documented every unusual HOA incident over the past year. Arbitrary rule changes, selective enforcement, personal vendettas masked as community concerns. A pattern began to emerge. Becky seemed to target anyone who challenged her authority or didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be. "Mind if I take pictures of these notes?" I asked Carol. She readily agreed, and I carefully photographed each page. "You might want to talk to James O'Connor down the street," Pete suggested. "He's a retired lawyer, and he's been watching Becky's behavior with concern. Said something about her actions potentially crossing some legal lines." I made a mental note to visit James soon. Something told me I'd need all the allies and advice I could get. That evening, as I sat on my swing watching the sunset, Sarah Chen stopped by with her girls as usual. 8-year-old Emily and 6-year-old. Sophie immediately asked for their customary swing ride, while Sarah shared some interesting information. "I heard about this morning's inspection," she said, making air quotes with her fingers. "But what you might not know is that Becky's been showing around some sort of presentation to select neighbors. Something about modernizing the neighborhood's image. Lisa Baker told me she saw it yesterday. Apparently, it includes plans for standardizing all front porch furniture. No more personal choice." I frowned. "Can she actually do that? Change the rules like that?" Sarah shook her head. "Not without a proper vote and process. But from what Lisa said, Becky's trying to build support before the meeting. She's been telling people that unique features like porch swings could lower property values by making the neighborhood look inconsistent." Emily looked up from the swing, her face worried. "Mum says Mrs. Thompson wants to take away your swing." "But you won't let her, right, Miss Jenny? We love this swing." I smiled at her concern. "Don't worry, Emily. The swing isn't going anywhere." After Sarah and the girls left, I sat down at my computer and started researching. I looked up state laws regarding HOA regulations, documented every relevant section of our current HOA guidelines, and started a detailed log of all interactions regarding the swing. I also began gathering photos of other homes in the neighborhood with personal porch furniture. There were plenty of rocking chairs, benches, and even a porch bed swing 3 streets over. The next morning, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood with my camera, documenting all the various porch furniture I could find. As I walked, several neighbors stopped to chat, and I started hearing more stories about Becky's increasing attempts to control every aspect of the neighborhood's appearance. Frank Martinez, the HOA treasurer, was working in his garden as I passed. He waved me over, speaking in a low voice. "Listen, Jenny, I feel like I should warn you. Becky's been going through the HOA budget, looking for ways to fund her neighborhood modernization project. She's talking about hiring professional property assessors to evaluate how different exterior features impact home values. Between you and me, I think she's trying to build a case against anything she personally doesn't like." I thanked Frank for the information, adding it to my growing documentation. By the time I returned home, I had photos of 17 different properties with personal porch furniture, notes from conversations with 8 different neighbors, and a clearer picture of what I was up against. That afternoon, I decided to visit James O'Connor, the retired lawyer Pete had mentioned. James lived in a beautifully maintained colonial-style home at the end of Cedar Street. When I explained the situation, he invited me in for tea and listened carefully to everything I'd gathered so far. "You're smart to document everything," he said, reviewing my notes. "Becky's walking a fine line here. HOAs do have certain powers, but they can't arbitrarily create new rules without proper procedure. And they certainly can't target specific residents for personal reasons." He pulled out a legal pad and started writing. "Here's what you need to keep doing. First, maintain that documentation trail. Every interaction, every photo, every conversation, record it all. Second, start gathering written statements from neighbors who've witnessed or experienced similar behavior. Third, make sure you attend that HOA meeting on Thursday. And record it if possible. Check your state's recording laws first, but most HOA meetings are considered public enough to allow it. James spent the next hour explaining the legal rights of HOA residents and the limitations of HOA powers. By the time I left, I had 3 pages of notes and a much clearer understanding of my position. When I got home, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a notice about Thursday's HOA meeting with a detailed agenda. Near the bottom, under New Business, was an item that made my heart sink. Discussion and vote on new exterior furniture guidelines for maintaining neighborhood aesthetic consistency. I immediately started making phone calls. First to the Andersons, then to Sarah Chen, the Bakers, and several other neighbors I'd met who seemed opposed to Becky's increasingly controlling behavior. We needed to be prepared for Thursday's meeting. That night, as I sat on my swing watching the stars come out, I thought about my grandmother. She'd always told me that sometimes the smallest things are worth fighting for, not because of what they are, but because of what they represent. This wasn't just about a porch swing anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could bully people into submission through bureaucracy and manipulation. I pulled out my phone and started recording a video diary, documenting everything that had happened so far. Something told me this story was far from over, and I wanted to make sure I had every detail preserved. The Thursday of the HOA meeting arrived with a sense of brewing tension. I'd spent the previous days preparing, gathering documentation, and talking with neighbors. James O'Connor, our resident retired lawyer, had helped me understand exactly what rights homeowners had versus HOA authority. I had my binder of evidence ready, including photos of other porch furniture in the neighborhood, Carol's detailed notes about previous incidents, and printouts of the current HOA guidelines. I arrived at the community center 30 minutes early, wanting to get a good seat and observe who showed up. To my surprise, the parking lot was already half full. Usually, according to Pete and Carol Anderson, HOA meetings attracted maybe 15 or 20 people at most. Tonight it looked like we'd have a much bigger crowd. Sarah Chen was already there, helping set up chairs. She gave me a knowing smile as I walked in. "Word got around about Becky's modernization plans," she whispered. "Nobody's too happy about the idea of standardized porch furniture." The Bakers arrived next. Tim and Lisa, along with several other neighbors I'd met during my documentation walks. Everyone seemed to be carrying folders or notebooks. Clearly, I wasn't the only one who'd come prepared. At exactly 6:55 p.m., Becky Thompson swept into the room, flanked by Greg Wilson and Diana Cooper. She faltered slightly when she saw the size. Of the crowd, there must have been at least 50 people packed into the community center's main room. Frank Martinez, the HOA treasurer, trailed behind them, looking uncomfortable. "Well, this is certainly a good turnout," Becky announced, trying to sound pleased while her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Though I do wish people had RSVP'd. We might need to get more chairs." "I'll get them," Diana offered quickly, seemingly glad for an excuse to step away from Becky's side. As people settled in, I noticed James O'Connor sitting in the back corner, legal pad ready. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod. Having him there made me feel more confident about what was coming. Becky called the meeting to order precisely at 7 p.m., going through the standard procedures with rigid efficiency. Minutes from the last meeting, Treasury report, old business. She rushed through it all like she was racing toward something. Finally, she reached new business on the agenda. "Now, as everyone knows, maintaining our property values is the HOA's primary concern," she began, her voice taking on that familiar condescending tone. "We've noticed some concerning trends in exterior decorating choices that could impact our neighborhood's premium status. Greg stood up and started distributing glossy packets, the presentation Sarah had mentioned. I flipped through it, my blood beginning to boil. The packet was full of cherry-picked photos showing the wrong kind of porch furniture, including a particularly unflattering angle of my swing. Next to each bad example was a good example, all featuring the same modern minimalist furniture style. As you can see, Becky continued, inconsistent exterior decorating choices can create a chaotic, unplanned appearance that potential buyers find off-putting. Our property assessment consultant... Excuse me, Frank Martinez interrupted. But what property assessment consultant? The board hasn't approved any expenditure for consultants. Becky's smile tightened. We're still in the proposal phase, Frank. If you'd let me finish. I think we should discuss any consulting expenses before moving forward with proposals based on their input, Frank persisted. Several people nodded in agreement. We can discuss the budget details later, Becky said dismissively. The important thing is the impact on our property values. Our research suggests that standardizing exterior furniture choices could increase home values by up to 15%. What research? I stood up, holding my own documentation. I've been looking into property values in communities with and without strict exterior furniture regulations. There's no evidence supporting that claim. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Becky's face flushed slightly. We have our sources, Jenny. Now, if we could move on to the proposed guidelines, I think we should discuss those sources. Tim Baker called out, especially if they're being used to justify new restrictions on our properties. And who's paying for this consultant? Someone else asked. Becky raised her voice slightly. If we could all just focus on the proposal itself. We're suggesting a simple standardization of exterior furniture. All existing non-compliant items would need to be removed within 30 days. The room erupted. People started talking all at once, many standing up in protest. I saw Diana Cooper shrink further into her chair, while Greg Wilson tried unsuccessfully to call for order. You can't just make up new rules without proper procedure, James O'Connor's authoritative voice cut through the chaos. HOA bylaws require any new restrictions to be properly proposed, reviewed, and voted on by all homeowners, not just the board. We are following procedure, Becky insisted. That's why we're having this vote tonight. A vote we just found. Out about? Lisa Baker stood up. With no time to review the full implications or discuss alternatives. And what about selective enforcement? I added, pulling out my photos. I've documented 17 different properties with personal porch furniture. Why are some being targeted and not others? The room got quiet as I started passing around my photos. They clearly showed the variety of porch furniture throughout. The neighborhood, rocking chairs, benches, swings, even elaborate seating areas. Those aren't relevant, Becky stammered. We're talking about new guidelines moving forward. Actually, they're very relevant, James O'Connor interjected. Selective enforcement of HOA rules can be grounds for legal action, especially if it appears to target specific residents. Frank Martinez cleared his throat. I think we should also discuss the financial aspects. These proposed changes would require significant enforcement resources. As treasurer, I have concerns about the impact on our budget. Becky was starting to look flustered. The financial details can be worked out later. Right now, we need to focus on protecting our property values. By forcing everyone to buy new furniture, Sarah Chen stood up. My kids love Jenny's porch swing. It adds character to the neighborhood. Since when did having a welcoming, friendly community become bad for property values? More voices joined in, sharing stories about neighborhood gatherings, children playing, and the sense of community that personal touches like porch furniture helped create. Diana Cooper suddenly spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. I have something to say. All eyes turned to her. The board never properly voted on these new guidelines. Becky just told us we were going to propose them. The room went completely silent. Becky's face turned red. Diana, that's not... It's true, Diana continued, straightening in her chair. And I've been uncomfortable with how this whole situation has been handled. We're supposed to serve the community, not dictate personal choices that aren't even covered in our guidelines. Greg Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then slowly nodded. Diana's right. This hasn't been handled properly. The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Becky tried repeatedly to bring things back to her agenda, but the crowd wasn't having it. People were standing up, sharing their own stories of dealing with arbitrary rule enforcement and excessive HOA interference. James O'Connor finally stood up again. I move that we table any discussion of new exterior furniture guidelines until a proper proposal can be prepared and distributed to all homeowners for review. This should include a detailed budget impact analysis, clear enforcement procedures, and evidence supporting any claims about property values. I second that motion, Frank Martinez said quickly. Becky looked like she'd swallowed something sour, but she couldn't ignore proper procedure with so many witnesses. When the vote was called, the motion passed overwhelmingly. But Becky wasn't done. As the meeting was wrapping up, she approached me with that same artificial smile. Jenny, I hope you understand that we're just trying to maintain standards here. It would be such a shame if we had to start enforcing other guidelines more strictly. Some people might find their property subject to much closer inspection. She didn't realize that Sarah Chen was standing right behind her, recording every word on her phone. Are you threatening selective enforcement as retaliation, Becky? I asked loudly enough for others to hear. Because that would be a serious legal issue, wouldn't it, Mr. O'Connor? James looked up from his legal pad. Indeed it would, a very serious issue. Becky's face went pale. She turned and practically fled the room, Greg hurrying after her, while Diana stayed behind, talking quietly with Frank Martinez. As people were leaving, many stopped to thank me for speaking up. Tim Baker clapped me on the shoulder. Someone needed to stand up to her. This has been building for months. The Andersons gave me proud smiles. Just like your grandmother taught you, Carol said, stand your ground when it matters. But I knew this wasn't over. Becky Thompson had been publicly challenged and embarrassed. Something told me she wouldn't take that lying down. Later that night, as I sat on my porch swing under the stars, Sarah Chen came over with 2 glasses of wine. You know she's going to make this personal now, she said, handing me a glass. I nodded. I know, but I've got everything documented and now we know we're not alone. The whole neighborhood is watching. Well, whatever she tries next, you've got backup. Sarah raised her glass. To porch swings and standing up to bullies. I clinked my glass against hers, but my mind was already racing. What would Becky's next move be? The HOA meeting had been a major setback for her, but something told me she had more tricks up her sleeve. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up early to enjoy my usual coffee on the porch swing. The neighborhood was quiet, with just a few early joggers passing by. Everything seemed normal, but there was this underlying tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that Becky was planning something. My instincts were right. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the distinctive sound of a truck pulling up outside my house. When I looked out, I saw it was from Premium Property Assessors, a company I'd never heard of before. 2 men in polo shirts got out, carrying clipboards and cameras. They walked right up to my property line and started taking pictures, paying particular attention to my porch swing. I immediately started recording on my phone and walked out to meet them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my voice friendly but firm. The older of the 2 men gave me a professional smile. "Good morning, ma'am. We're conducting a property assessment for the HOA. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure. Standard procedure? I raised an eyebrow. That's interesting because our HOA treasurer confirmed at last night's meeting that no property assessment consultants had been approved by the board. Do you have official authorization to be here? They exchanged uncomfortable glances. The younger man pulled out his phone and stepped away to make a call. I could guess who he was calling. Sure enough, within 10 minutes, Becky's silver Mercedes came speeding down the street. She got out, clutching a folder and wearing what I'd come to think of as her official business blazer. "Jenny, I see you've met our property assessors," she said, that fake smile firmly in place. "We're just doing some preliminary evaluations for the Neighborhood Improvement Initiative." I kept my phone recording. The initiative that was tabled last night pending proper review and homeowner approval. The one that Frank Martinez specifically said hadn't been budgeted for? Becky's smile flickered slightly. "This is a separate matter. As HOA president, I have discretionary authority to conduct property evaluations when there are concerns about neighborhood standards." "Really? I'd love to see the documentation for that authority. And while you're at it, could you share the official HOA contract with this assessment company?" The younger assessor stepped forward. "Ms. Thompson, you told us this was an officially sanctioned HOA evaluation." "It is," Becky snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "I'm the HOA president." "Being president doesn't give you unilateral authority," a new voice joined the conversation. James O'Connor was walking up my driveway, looking every bit the experienced lawyer he was. "Gentlemen, I'm James O'Connor, legal counsel for Ms. Mitchell. I'd strongly advise you to verify your authorization before conducting any assessments. Operating without proper HOA board approval could expose your company to liability." The assessors couldn't pack up their equipment fast enough. As they drove away, Becky turned to me, her face flushed with anger. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Jenny. All we want is a cohesive, upscale neighborhood appearance." "No, Becky," I corrected her. "All you want is control. The neighborhood never had these issues before you became HOA president." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You know, there are lots of ways the HOA can make life difficult for problematic residents. Lots of rules that might need extra strict enforcement." James cleared his throat. "That sounds remarkably like a threat of selective enforcement, Ms. Thompson. Would you like to rephrase that?" Becky spun on her heel and stormed back to her car. As she drove away, James turned to me with a concerned expression. "She's getting sloppy, making mistakes. That makes her more dangerous." He was right. Over the next few days, Becky's campaign against my porch swing took on a new intensity. First came the letters, official-looking HOA notices citing various vague violations. My grass was allegedly a quarter-inch too long. My mailbox supposedly needed repainting. My garden beds were cited for non-standard plant spacing. I documented every letter and responded to each one with photos proving compliance with HOA guidelines. Sarah Chen helped me measure my grass height, and we photographed it next to a ruler. The Andersons provided dated photos of my recently painted mailbox. Tim Baker, who was a landscape architect, certified that my garden beds met all HOA specifications. But Becky wasn't done. One evening, as I was enjoying my usual time on the porch swing, I noticed several cars driving by slowly, their occupants taking pictures. At first, I thought they were just nosy neighbors, but then Lisa Baker called. "Jenny, you need to check Facebook," she said. "Becky's created a private group called Maintaining Maple Ridge Standards, and she's posting about your house." I quickly logged in and found the group. Sure enough, there were multiple photos of my house, particularly my porch swing, with comments from Becky about how certain elements were degrading neighborhood aesthetics and threatening property values. Most comments were defending. me, but a small group of Becky's supporters were actively agreeing with her. One even suggested organizing a petition to force compliance with appropriate exterior decorating standards. Diana Cooper, who was still the HOA secretary despite her stance at the meeting, secretly forwarded me emails showing that Becky was trying to push through emergency HOA bylaw changes without proper board approval or homeowner notification. She was attempting to grant herself broader powers for aesthetic enforcement. Frank Martinez, our treasurer, was fighting back through official channels, refusing to approve any expenditures for Becky's neighborhood improvement initiatives without proper board authorization. This led to a heated email exchange that Frank made sure to forward to all board members, clearly documenting Becky's attempts to circumvent proper procedures. The situation took an even darker turn when I woke up one morning to find a formal violation notice taped to my front door. According to the notice, someone had complained about excessive noise from my porch swing. The complaint alleged that the squeaking and creaking was disturbing neighbors and violated noise ordinances. This was absolutely ridiculous. Mike Roberts, who had installed the swing, had used high-quality silent hardware specifically to prevent any noise issues. I immediately called him to come do an inspection. Mike arrived that afternoon and thoroughly examined the swing. "There's not a sound coming from this thing," he declared, documenting everything with photos and video. "I've been installing porch swings for 20 years. This is one of the quietest I've ever set up." He provided me with a written statement confirming the swing's proper installation and maintenance, along with decibel readings showing that it produced no measurable noise. I added these to my growing file of documentation. The next day, Sarah, Jen's girls came by for their usual swing visit. 8-year-old Emily was upset. "Mrs. Thompson told my friend Katie that her mom shouldn't let her come to your house anymore because it's not a good example of neighborhood standards," she reported, her little face serious. This made my blood boil. Using children to spread. Her campaign was a new low. Sarah was furious when she heard about it. "That's it," she declared. "Time to fight fire with fire." Sarah, who worked in marketing, helped me create a positive social media campaign. We started posting photos and stories about community gatherings on my porch, children playing safely in the front yard, and neighbors coming together. The hashtag Porch Swing Community started gaining traction, with residents from other neighborhoods sharing their own stories about how personal touches like porch swings enhance their communities. James O'Connor, meanwhile, had been doing some digging. He discovered that Becky's property assessment consultants weren't actually licensed in our state. He also found some interesting connections between the consulting company and Becky's personal business interests. "She's getting kickbacks," he explained, showing me the documentation. "The company she hired for the assessments is owned by her brother-in-law. If she had succeeded in pushing through her standardized furniture requirements, guess who would have been the approved vendor for all the new furniture?" The evidence was damning, but we needed to be strategic about how to use it. James advised, keeping this information in reserve, continuing to document everything while building our case carefully. The community was definitely taking notice of what was happening. One evening, Pete Anderson called me over to his house. "You need to see this," he said, leading me to his home office. On his computer screen was a spreadsheet titled HOA Incident Log. "Carol's not the only one who's been keeping records," he explained. "Several of us longtime residents started documenting things when Becky took over. Look at this pattern." The spreadsheet was eye-opening. It showed a clear progression of how Becky had gradually increased her attempts to control every aspect of the neighborhood's appearance. What started with reasonable enforcement of existing rules had evolved into increasingly arbitrary and selective enforcement, usually targeting residents who questioned her authority. "There's more," Pete said, clicking to another tab. "We've been tracking property values in the neighborhood and surrounding areas. Despite Becky's claims about protecting property values, homes in our neighborhood have actually appreciated slightly less than similar properties in nearby communities. Without such strict HOA controls, this was valuable information, but it also made me nervous. Pete, you need to make sure this is securely backed up. If Becky finds out about this documentation... He patted my shoulder. Already handled. Everything's cloud-backed and copies have been distributed to trusted neighbors. We've learned to be careful. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Sitting on my porch swing at midnight, I reflected on how what started as a simple dispute about a porch swing had evolved into something much bigger. This wasn't just about furniture anymore. It was about preventing someone from abusing their authority to impose their personal preferences on an entire community. The next morning brought a new development. I opened my front door to find Diana Cooper standing there looking nervous but determined. "Jenny, I need to show you something," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if worried about being seen. She handed me a USB drive. "These are emails and documents from the HOA board's private server. I know I shouldn't share these, but people need to know what's really going on. Becky's not just targeting you anymore. She's planning a complete overhaul of the neighborhood guidelines. She wants to control everything, from the types of plants we can grow to the color of our curtains, visible from the street." I invited Diana in, and we spent the next hour going through the files. The scope of Becky's plans was staggering. She had drafted extensive new guidelines that would effectively turn our friendly neighborhood into something resembling a strictly controlled resort community. "Why is she doing this?" I asked Diana. "What's her endgame?" Diana sighed. "She's trying to impress the developer of that new luxury subdivision being built across town. From what I've overheard, she's hoping to get appointed as HOA president there too. She sees our neighborhood as her proof of concept for how she can maintain property values through strict control." The morning after Diana shared those files with me, I invited James O'Connor, Frank Martinez, and the Andersons over for an emergency strategy meeting. We gathered in my living room, away from prying eyes, as I connected my laptop to the TV to display the documents Diana had provided. The scope of Becky's plans was even more alarming when viewed on the large screen. She had drafted over 50 pages of new guidelines, with everything from mandatory exterior paint colors to approved window treatment styles. There were detailed specifications for lawn ornaments, holiday decorations, and even the types of vehicles that could be parked in driveways. "This goes way beyond normal HOA authority," James said, taking notes as we scrolled through the documents. "She's essentially trying to turn the neighborhood into a controlled display model for her personal ambitions." Frank shook his head as he reviewed the budget projections. "Look at these enforcement costs. She's planning to hire full-time compliance officers and install surveillance cameras at neighborhood entrances. The HOA fees would have to triple to cover all this." Carol Anderson was reading through the email exchanges between Becky and the luxury development company. According to these, she's been promising them she can demonstrate successful implementation of premium community standards in our neighborhood. She's using us as a test case for her bigger ambitions. As we discussed how to proceed, Sarah Chen arrived with more news. "You won't believe what just happened," she said, joining our group. "Becky's started going door to door with some kind of loyalty pledge. She's asking people to sign a document supporting her vision for neighborhood enhancement before they've even seen the actual proposals." This was a concerning development. We knew some residents might feel pressured to sign just to avoid conflict. Pete Anderson pulled up his incident spreadsheet, adding this new information to the pattern of escalating control attempts. "We need to act before she gets too many signatures," James advised. "Once people understand what they're really signing up for, they'll be less likely to support her plans. We spent the next few hours developing a strategy. Sarah would use her marketing expertise to create an information packet for residents, highlighting the most concerning aspects of Becky's proposals. Frank would prepare a detailed analysis of the financial impact on homeowners. The Andersons would activate their network of long-time residents to spread awareness. Just as we were wrapping up our meeting, Tim Baker called. "Jenny, you need to see this. Becky's at it again with the property assessors, but this time they're taking measurements of everyone's front porches. They're saying something about standardized architectural elements." I grabbed my phone and headed outside. Sure enough, there were two men with measuring tape and clipboards working their way down the street. They weren't from the same company as before. These ones had architectural compliance specialists on their polo shirts. As I started recording video of their activities, I noticed something interesting. They seemed to be paying particular attention to houses with personal touches like porch swings, decorative columns, or custom railings. I walked closer to hear what they were saying. According to the new guidelines, all non-standard porch elements will need to be removed. One was explaining to a confused homeowner. The HOA president has initiated a neighborhood-wide standardization program. "What new guidelines?" the homeowner asked. "We haven't voted on any changes." "Oh, these are being implemented under the HOA's emergency aesthetic control provisions," the assessor replied confidently. I interrupted at this point. "Excuse me, but there are no emergency aesthetic control provisions in our HOA bylaws. I'd be very interested to see the documentation you're working from." The assessors exchanged glances. Like the previous ones, they seemed uncomfortable when questioned about their authority. I pressed further. "Are you aware that operating under false pretenses could expose your company to liability?" Before they could respond, a familiar silver Mercedes came speeding around the corner. Becky practically jumped out of her car, her face flushed with anger. "Jenny, you need to stop interfering with official HOA business," she snapped, all pretense of friendliness gone. "These gentlemen are conducting authorized assessments for upcoming community improvements." "Authorized by whom?" I asked calmly, my phone still recording. "Because the HOA board hasn't approved any such assessments. Isn't that right, Frank?" Frank Martinez had followed me outside and was now standing nearby. "That's correct. No assessments have been authorized by the board, and no emergency provisions exist for architectural standardization." The assessors were already packing up their equipment. One of them pulled Becky aside, and I could hear him saying something about proper documentation and liability concerns. Moments later, they drove away, leaving Becky standing there seething. She turned to me, her voice low and threatening. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Always hiding behind rules and procedures. Well, enjoy your little victory. When the new guidelines are implemented, your precious porch swing won't be the only thing that has to go." "Are you referring to the guidelines you're secretly developing with that luxury development company?" I asked innocently. "The ones that would triple HOA fees and require everyone to basically rebuild their homes to your specifications?" The color drained from Becky's face. "How did you? Those documents are confidential." "Apparently not confidential enough," Frank commented. "The whole board has seen them now. There's going to be an emergency board meeting tomorrow to discuss your unauthorized activities." Becky's composure cracked completely. "You have no right. I'm trying to protect this community. Property values will soar once people start following proper aesthetic standards." "No, Becky," I said firmly. "You're trying to use our neighborhood as a stepping stone for your personal ambitions. We've seen the emails about your arrangement with the luxury development." She stormed back to her car, but before driving away, she rolled down her window. "This isn't over. I've got signed pledges of support from residents who understand the importance of maintaining standards. You'll see," The silent majority supports my vision. As her car disappeared around the corner, Sarah Chen walked up with her phone out. "Got it all on video," she said with a satisfied smile, "including that last threat. Should we add it to the evidence file?" James O'Connor, who had joined us outside, nodded. "Every interaction needs to be documented at this point. She's getting desperate, and that makes her dangerous." He was right about her getting desperate. That evening, my phone started blowing up with messages from neighbors. Becky was going door to door, now accompanied by Greg Wilson, telling people that their property values would plummet unless they signed her loyalty pledge immediately. Lisa Baker reported that Becky had told her the HOA would be forced to approve unlimited rental properties if the new guidelines weren't implemented, leading to undesirable elements moving into the neighborhood. The racist undertone of this threat was not lost on anyone. Another neighbor, Maria Rodriguez, called in tears because Becky had implied her recent landscaping improvements might need to be reviewed for compliance unless she signed the pledge. The intimidation tactics were getting out of hand. We quickly organized a phone tree to warn other residents about what was happening. Sarah Chen created a private social media group called Maple Ridge Community Unity, where people could report Becky's activities and support each other. Within hours, we had dozens of documented instances of her using threats and misinformation to gather signatures. The next morning, I woke up to find my porch swing had been vandalized. Someone had loosened all the hanging hardware during the night. If I hadn't checked it before sitting down, it could have been dangerous. My security cameras had caught the whole thing. A figure in dark clothing, face hidden under a hood, tampering with the swing at 3 a.m. While the image quality wasn't good enough to definitively identify the person, they had arrived and departed in a car that looked remarkably similar to Greg Wilson's. I called the police to file a report, emphasizing the potentially dangerous nature of the vandalism. Officer Steve Collins responded to the call. He was professional but concerned as he examined the swing and reviewed the security footage. "This goes beyond a simple vandalism case," he noted. "Deliberately creating a safety hazard could result in serious charges." As he was finishing up his report, Diana Cooper came rushing over. She was out of breath and clutching her laptop. "Jenny, you need to see this right away. I was processing the monthly HOA financial reports, and something's not right." We gathered around her laptop as she pulled up the HOA's bank statements. "Look at these transactions," she said, pointing to several large payments. "They're listed as community improvement consulting fees, but they're being paid to a company I've never heard of. When I looked up the company, guess who owns it?" "Let me guess. Becky's brother-in-law again?" I asked. Diana shook her head. "Even better, it's a company registered to Becky herself. She's been paying HOA funds to her own consulting company." Officer Collins looked over Diana's shoulder at the transactions. "Ma'am, if you can document this clearly, it could constitute financial fraud. Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" Diana hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I'll document everything. This has gone too far." As if on cue, Frank Martinez called. He had been doing his own investigation into the HOA finances and had discovered even more irregularities. Becky had been using HOA funds to pay for her property assessors and even to print her propaganda materials about neighborhood standardization. "The emergency board meeting is at 2 o'clock, he said. "I've got all the financial documentation ready. With Diana's evidence about the consulting company, we've got her dead to rights." Word must have gotten back to Becky about what we'd discovered. Around noon, she sent out a mass email to all residents announcing her immediate resignation as HOA president, citing personal reasons and hostile elements in the community resistant to positive change. But she couldn't resist one final shot. The email concluded with a threat. Those who have worked against community improvement will soon learn that actions have consequences. Property values will suffer, and residents will only have themselves to blame. The emergency board meeting went ahead as scheduled, despite Becky's resignation. The community center was packed. Word had spread about the financial irregularities, and everyone wanted answers. Frank Martinez, our treasurer, had prepared a detailed presentation of his findings. Over the past year, Frank began, displaying spreadsheets on the projector screen. Approximately $147,000 of HOA funds were paid to various consulting companies for supposed property assessments and community improvement studies. What we've discovered is that these companies all trace back to either Becky Thompson herself or her immediate family members. The room erupted in angry murmurs. These weren't small amounts. Every homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates had contributed to these funds through their HOA fees. Diana Cooper, still serving as secretary, stood up next. I have documentation showing that none of these consulting contracts were properly approved by the board. The signatures on the approval forms were forged, including mine. James O'Connor, who was sitting next to me, immediately recognized the legal implications. That moves this from mismanagement into criminal territory, he whispered. Greg Wilson, who had been Becky's strongest supporter on the board, looked shell-shocked. I knew about the consultants, but she told me they were legitimate companies. She said they were recommended by the Luxury Development Group. About that, Sarah Chen interjected, pulling up emails on her laptop. I did some digging into Golden Vista Estates, the luxury development Becky was trying to impress. They've never heard of her. The email correspondence she showed the board was fabricated. They're not looking for an HOA president, and they have no interest in our neighborhood's aesthetic standards. This revelation hit Greg hard. He slumped in his chair, looking defeated. She played us all for fools, said she was protecting property values, but she was just lining her own pockets. Tim Baker raised his hand. What about all those property assessments and reports we paid for? Do they even exist? Frank shook his head. We've found no evidence of any actual assessment work being done. The photos used in Becky's presentations about neighborhood standards were taken from real estate websites. Some weren't even from our state. As the meeting continued, more residents came forward with stories. Emily Watson, our local real estate agent, revealed that Becky had tried to pressure her into falsifying property value reports to support her claims about aesthetic impact. She wanted me to say that homes with personal touches like Porch, swings were selling for less, Emily explained. When I refused and showed her the actual market data proving the opposite, she threatened to have my real estate license reported for ethics violations. The revelations kept coming. Pete Anderson shared his spreadsheet tracking HOA incidents under Becky's leadership, showing a clear pattern of selective enforcement and harassment. Maria Rodriguez described how Becky had demanded kickbacks from her landscaping business in exchange for being added to the HOA's approved vendors list. Officer Steve Collins, who had been quietly observing the meeting, finally spoke up. Given the evidence presented here, we're looking at multiple potential criminal charges. The department will need formal statements from everyone who's been affected. Just then, Lisa Baker burst into the room, out of breath. You all need to see this right away, she said, pulling up a website on her phone. Becky just listed her house for sale, way below market value. She's trying to cut and run. This news created fresh chaos. If Becky sold her house and left, the neighborhood, recovering the misappropriated funds, would become much more difficult. James O'Connor immediately started making calls to his legal contacts about freezing assets. Frank Martinez pulled up the HOA's bank accounts on his laptop and his face went pale. She's cleaned out the reserve account, he announced. Everything except the minimum required balance, almost $200,000, gone. Officer Collins was already on his radio, calling for additional units. "This has just escalated from possible fraud to grand theft," he said grimly. "We need to move quickly." But Becky had planned her exit carefully. When police arrived at her house, it was already empty. No furniture, no cars, nothing. Neighbors reported seeing a moving truck early that morning, before her resignation email went out. She must have been planning this for weeks, Diana realized. That's why she was pushing so hard for those new guidelines and trying to get people to sign loyalty pledges. She needed to maintain control long enough to finish emptying the accounts. The implications of this hit everyone hard. The HOA reserve fund was meant for major repairs and emergencies. Without it, we were vulnerable. Sarah Chen voiced what everyone was thinking. What happens if we have a real emergency now? Storm damage, road repairs. That's when something remarkable started happening. Tim Baker stood up. "I'm a civil engineer. I'll volunteer my services for any infrastructure assessments we need. No charge." Maria Rodriguez was next. "My landscaping company will handle common area maintenance at cost until the reserve fund is rebuilt." One by one, neighbors started offering their skills and resources. Mike Roberts, who had installed my porch swing, volunteered to do safety inspections of all common area structures. Emily Watson offered to create a real market analysis to help with budget planning. Pete Anderson cleared his throat. "Carol and I have some savings set aside. We'd be willing to make an interest-free loan to the HOA for emergency purposes until the legal situation is resolved." More offers followed. People were signing up for volunteer committees, offering professional services, and coming together in a way I'd never seen before. The crisis Becky had created was actually strengthening our community. James O'Connor outlined our legal options. "We can file civil suits to recover the funds, and the police will handle the criminal aspects. But we need to focus on immediate community needs first. We should elect an interim board and establish emergency protocols." Frank Martinez was unanimously elected as interim president, with Diana Cooper staying on as secretary. New board members were nominated and voted in, including Sarah Chen as communications director and Tim Baker as maintenance coordinator. As the meeting was wrapping up, Officer Collins received a call. "The detective unit has some leads on Becky's whereabouts," he reported. "Looks like she might have fled to her sister's place in the next state. We're coordinating with authorities there." But we had more immediate concerns. Going through the HOA's records more carefully, we discovered that Becky hadn't just taken the reserve fund. She had also left several bills unpaid, including the neighborhood's liability insurance premium. "Without liability insurance, we can't legally operate many community facilities," Frank explained. "The playground, the pool, even the walking trails, they'd all have to close until we get new coverage." This was serious. It was summer, and families relied on these facilities. Closing them would affect everyone, especially families with young children who use the pool and playground daily. That's when James O'Connor made an unexpected offer. "My law firm's insurance broker might be able to help. We could potentially get emergency coverage, but we'd need to show the insurance company that we have proper management and safety protocols in place." The next few hours were intense. People stepped up to form committees, documenting safety procedures, organizing facility inspections, and creating maintenance schedules. What could have been a disaster turned into a demonstration of community strength. Sarah Chen set up a secure communication system using a neighborhood app, ensuring everyone would stay informed about developments. "Transparency is crucial, right? Now," she emphasized, "no more secret meetings or hidden agendas." By the end of the evening, we had a clear action plan. The new board would meet daily until the crisis was stabilized. Volunteer committees would handle immediate maintenance needs. A legal team, led by James O'Connor, would pursue asset recovery. Most importantly, the community was united. As people were leaving the meeting, Carol Anderson tapped my shoulder. "Come here," she said, leading me to my porch swing. Several neighbors followed. "You know, this swing started all this." Becky tried to use it as a symbol of what she thought was wrong with our neighborhood. But look what it's actually done. It's brought us together. People stop to chat here, kids play here, neighbors connect here. That's what community is really about. She was right. What Becky never understood was that a neighborhood isn't about perfectly coordinated exterior paint colors or standardized porch furniture. It's about people coming together, supporting each other, and creating a place where everyone feels at home. It was early morning, about 3 days after our emergency HOA meeting, and I had stopped at the Daily Grind, our local coffee shop, before heading to work. I was exhausted from late-night committee meetings and endless phone calls about the HOA situation. The young barista, Katie, knew my usual order and had it ready before I reached the counter. As I waited for my coffee, I overheard 2 women in business suits at a nearby table discussing property management. I wouldn't have paid attention normally, but one of them mentioned aesthetic standardization, a phrase I'd come to associate with Becky's schemes. "The Thompson method really works," one woman was saying. "She's implemented it in 3 other communities already. The HOA fees go up, but property values supposedly increase enough to offset the cost." I pretended to be busy with my phone, but kept listening. The other woman seemed skeptical. "But isn't there usually pushback from residents? People don't like being told what to do with their own property. That's why you have to do it gradually. Start with small changes, build support from key community members, then push through bigger restrictions once you have control of the board. Becky says the trick is to make people think it's their idea." My heart was racing. I carefully snapped a few photos of the women with my phone while appearing to take selfies. As they got up to leave, I noticed their company badges. Premium Communities Management Group. I immediately called James O'Connor. "James, I think we just found evidence that this goes beyond our neighborhood. Becky's been running this scheme in other communities." James arrived at the coffee shop within 15 minutes. Katie, the barista, confirmed that the 2 women were regular customers who often met there early mornings. She even remembered hearing them mention specific neighborhoods. "They talk about property values and community standards all the time," Katie said. "Last week they were laughing about some neighborhood where they got everyone to replace their porch furniture because it looked too country." We quickly contacted Officer Collins with this new information. He brought in a detective who specialized in white-collar crime, and things started moving fast. The detective recognized Premium Communities Management Group. They were already under investigation in another county for suspicious real estate practices. Sarah Chen's marketing skills came in handy once again. She created a secure online form where residents from other neighborhoods could report similar experiences with HOA overreach and suspicious financial activities. We shared it through local community groups and neighborhood networks. The responses started pouring in almost immediately. A pattern emerged. Becky, or someone working with her, would get elected to an HOA board, gradually implement restrictive guidelines, hire specific consulting companies for assessments, and eventually drain the reserve funds before moving on to the next target. Diana Cooper spent hours cross-referencing the reports with HOA financial records. "Look at these consulting company names," she said, showing me her findings. "They're all variations of the same few companies, just registered in different states. And guess who shows up as an officer in all of them? Becky's sister, Patricia Henderson." The connection to Patricia explained why Becky had fled to her sister's place. They were in this together. The detective was particularly interested in this detail. "We've been trying to connect these cases," he explained. This could help us establish a pattern of organized fraud. Frank Martinez discovered something else while reviewing old bank statements. The timing of Becky's arrival in our neighborhood wasn't random. She moved here right after another HOA in the next county reported their reserve fund missing. She's been systematically targeting communities across the region. Tim Baker's wife, Lisa, had been following real estate listings in the areas where Becky had previously operated. Every time she drains an HOA fund, property values actually drop in that neighborhood, Lisa reported. Her claims about increasing property values were completely backwards. She was causing the very problem she claimed to be preventing. The investigation was gaining momentum when we got unexpected help from an unlikely source. Greg Wilson, Becky's former ally on the board, came forward with crucial information. The guilt of his unwitting participation in her schemes had been eating at him. She had this whole system, Greg explained during a meeting with the detective. She would identify neighborhoods with healthy reserve funds, then either get elected to the board or plant someone who would help her gain control. The aesthetic guidelines were just a distraction, a way to keep people focused on minor issues while she and her sister set up the fake consulting companies. Greg had saved every email and document, including messages where Becky had instructed him on how to pressure residents into supporting her proposals. "She told me we were protecting the neighborhood," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never thought to question where all those consulting fees were really going." The detective was particularly interested in a series of emails between Becky and Patricia discussing their next targets. They had created a ranking system for potential neighborhoods based on reserve fund size and what they called community of vulnerability. They looked for places with minimal financial oversight, Greg explained. Communities where people trusted their HOA boards and didn't ask too many questions. We were perfect, financially stable but not too nosy about where the money was going. As word spread about the investigation, more people started coming forward. A former board member from one of Becky's previous neighborhoods reached out. Through our online form, she had documentation showing similar patterns of behavior, the same consulting companies, the same push for aesthetic standardization, the same gradual draining of reserve funds. James O'Connor was working with authorities to coordinate the various cases. "This is turning into a multi-state investigation," he reported during our daily committee meeting. "The FBI is getting involved because of the interstate nature of the fraud." The coffee shop became our unofficial headquarters for sharing information. Katie, the barista, kept us updated whenever the Premium Communities Management Group women came in. She even managed to snap a photo of the meeting with Patricia Henderson herself. One morning, about a week after my initial coffee shop discovery, Sarah Chen burst into our committee meeting with breaking news. "You're not going to believe this," she said, pulling up a website on her laptop. "Remember how Becky was so interested in that luxury development? Look who's listed as their new HOA management company." There it was. Premium Communities Management Group had just been awarded the contract to manage Golden Vista Estates, the luxury development Becky had been so eager to impress. But that wasn't all. "Check out their leadership team page," Sarah said, scrolling down. And there was Patricia Henderson, listed as Director of Community Standards. The photo showed her standing with the same two women I'd overheard at the coffee shop. Officer Collins immediately forwarded this information to the detective. Within hours, we learned that search warrants were being executed at Premium Communities Management Group's offices and Patricia Henderson's home. The timing couldn't have been better. According to Greg, Becky and Patricia had been planning to implement their scheme in at least 3 more neighborhoods before the end of the year. The documentation seized during the searches would help prevent other communities from falling victim to their fraud. But we still had our own neighborhood to worry about. The missing reserve funds had left us vulnerable, and while the community had come together admirably, we needed a long-term solution. That's when Emily Watson came up with an innovative idea. What if we turn this whole experience into something positive? She suggested during a community meeting. Instead of just rebuilding our reserve fund, we could create a new model for HOA management, one based on transparency and actual community input. The idea caught on quickly. Sarah Chen developed a community engagement platform where residents could actively participate in neighborhood decisions. Frank Martinez implemented new financial oversight procedures that made it virtually impossible for any one person to control community funds. Tim Baker and his engineering colleagues created a comprehensive infrastructure assessment program, documenting everything that would need maintenance or replacement in the coming years. This helped us develop a realistic budget and timeline for rebuilding our reserves. The porch swing that had started all this drama became a symbol of our community's resilience. Neighbors began adding their own personal touches to their porches: rocking chairs, bench swings, comfortable seating areas where people could gather and chat. "You know what's ironic?" Carol Anderson said one evening as we sat on my porch swing, watching kids play in the front yards. "Becky was so worried about property values, but our neighborhood has never been more attractive to buyers. Emily says she's getting calls every day from people who've heard about our strong community spirit." She was right. Despite Becky's claims that personal touches would decrease property values, homes in our neighborhood were now selling faster and for better prices than similar properties in more restricted communities. It turned out that people actually preferred neighborhoods with character and active community involvement. The investigation was still ongoing, but we had already learned valuable lessons about the importance of community oversight and the dangers of giving any one person too much control. More importantly, we discovered the true strength of our neighborhood, not in standardized appearances or strict rules, but in the connections between neighbors who cared about each other. The morning after the FBI executed their search warrants, at Premium Communities Management Group, I received an unexpected email. It was from someone named Robert Martinez, no relation to our treasurer Frank, who lived in a neighborhood called Riverside Gardens, about 50 miles away. He had seen our online form for reporting similar HOA experiences and wanted to meet in person. James O'Connor agreed to host the meeting at his home office, where we could ensure privacy and record everything properly. When Robert arrived, he brought 3 large boxes of documents and a laptop full of evidence. What he shared with us was astounding. "We've been tracking Becky and Patricia's activities for almost 3 years, Robert explained, spreading documents across James's conference table. "It started when they took over our HOA back in 2022. We lost nearly $300,000 in reserve funds before we realized what was happening." Robert's documentation was meticulous. He had spreadsheets tracking every suspicious transaction, copies of forged documents, and even surveillance photos of meetings between Becky, Patricia, and various consultants. But what really caught our attention was the network map he had created. "After they left our neighborhood, I started reaching out to other communities they'd targeted," Robert continued. "Each time I found one, it led to 2 or 3 more. They've been running this same scheme across 4 states, always staying just ahead of local investigations." Sarah Chen examined the network map carefully. "These patterns are incredible," she said. "They always start with aesthetic controls, then move to expensive consultants and finally drain the reserves. But look at the timing. They never hit 2 adjacent communities at once. They space them out to avoid drawing attention." The detective assigned to our case arrived shortly after, excited about what the FBI had found in their searches. Premium Communities Management Group was just the tip of the iceberg, he explained. They had shell companies set up in 12 different states. Every time authorities would start investigating one company, they'd abandon it and start operating under a new name. Robert's evidence helped fill in many gaps in the investigation. He had managed to trace money transfers between various accounts, showing how Becky and Patricia moved funds through multiple shell companies before finally transferring them offshore. The really clever part, Robert explained, was how they used the consulting fees to launder the money. They'd have their fake companies charge outrageous fees for assessments and studies, then funnel that money through a series of transactions that made it almost impossible to track. As we discussed the evidence, more people started arriving. The detective had invited representatives from other affected communities to share their experiences. Among them was Eleanor Wright, a retired forensic accountant who had been documenting financial irregularities in her neighborhood. "They almost succeeded in taking over our HOA last year," Eleanor shared, "but something about their property value claims seemed off to me. When I started digging into their consultant credentials, everything fell apart." Eleanor had created detailed financial analyses showing how Becky and Patricia's schemes actually damaged property values in every community they targeted. The expensive improvements they mandated, combined with increased HOA fees and the eventual loss of reserve funds, made their neighborhoods less attractive to buyers. "The real estate impact goes beyond just the stolen funds," Eleanor explained, pulling up graphs on her laptop. "When you factor in decreased property values, increased insurance costs due to lost coverage, and the expense of replacing unnecessary improvements, each community lost an average of $500,000. Tim Baker whistled softly at these numbers. No wonder they kept moving around. They were making millions. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent call from Officer Collins. The FBI had just arrested Patricia Henderson at her home, but Becky was still missing. However, they had discovered something interesting. Emails showing that Becky had recently been in contact with someone in our neighborhood. Greg Wilson, who was at the meeting, went pale. "She called me last week," he admitted. "I didn't say anything because I thought she was just trying to get information about the investigation. But she mentioned something about needing to tie up loose ends in the neighborhood." The detective immediately got on his phone, calling for increased patrols in our area. Greg shared the number Becky had called from, though it was probably a burner phone. What worried everyone was the loose ends comment. Was she planning something? Sarah Chen quickly organized an emergency notification through our community alert system, warning everyone to be vigilant and report any suspicious activity. The timing was crucial because we had just started implementing our new financial oversight procedures. That's when Maria Rodriguez remembered something important. "Last month, before all this started, Becky had asked me to sign some blank HOA, checks for emergency landscaping needs. I refused, but she was really insistent about it." Frank Martinez pulled up the HOA's current bank records. "Look at these pending transactions," he said, pointing to his screen. "There are 3 checks written just before Becky resigned, all made out to a company called Community Enhancement Solutions. They haven't cleared yet." James O'Connor immediately called the bank to stop payment on those checks. It was a good call. When they investigated, Community Enhancement Solutions turned out to be another shell company, this one registered just 2 weeks earlier. As everyone shared information, patterns emerged that we hadn't noticed before. The coffee shop women from Premium Communities Management Group had been seen meeting with other people in our neighborhood, not just Becky. They had been quietly building a network of supporters for their next phase of improvements. Lisa Baker had been tracking real estate listings in our area and noticed something concerning. "There are 6 houses in the neighborhood listed for sale right now, all significantly below market value, and they're all owned by people who signed Becky's loyalty pledge." The detective was very interested in this detail. They might be trying to drive down property values temporarily to justify their claims about needed improvements. We've seen this tactic before: create a problem, then sell the solution. Eleanor Wright examined the listings. These prices make no sense unless... Wait a minute. She pulled up property records for several other neighborhoods Becky had targeted. Look at this pattern. After they drain the HOA funds, there's always a cluster of underpriced sales. Then a few months later, the same properties are resold at much higher prices. They're working with someone in real estate, Emily Watson realized, someone who can help them flip these properties once the neighborhood starts to recover. Robert Martinez nodded grimly. The same thing happened. In our neighborhood, a group of investors swooped in and bought several houses right after the HOA scandal broke. 6 months later, they sold them for nearly double the price. The detective made some calls and confirmed that the same investment group had been involved in property purchases in multiple communities that Becky and Patricia had targeted. This wasn't just about stealing HOA funds, it was a complex real estate fraud scheme. Pete Anderson had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. "We need to warn other communities," he said. "They might have already laid the groundwork in their next target neighborhoods." Sarah Chen and her marketing team got to work immediately, creating an information package that could be shared with other HOAs. They included warning signs to watch for, like sudden pushes for aesthetic standardization, expensive consulting contracts, and pressure to increase reserve funds. James O'Connor was coordinating with law enforcement and prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. "The FBI is treating this as an organized crime investigation now," he reported. "The real estate angle makes it much bigger than simple HOA fraud." As the meeting was wrapping up, Katie from the coffee shop called with urgent news. She had overheard the Premium Communities Management Group women discussing plans to meet someone at the airport the next morning. The detective immediately relayed this information to the FBI. That evening, as we all processed everything we'd learned, I sat on my porch swing, trying to make sense of it all. What had started as a simple dispute over neighborhood aesthetics had uncovered a multi-state criminal enterprise. Sarah Chen joined me, bringing a fresh pot of coffee. "You know what's amazing?" she said. "None of this would have come to light if you hadn't stood your ground about this swing. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can expose the biggest problems." Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to find out what happened next. The FBI's airport operation led to some unexpected arrests, and you won't believe who else was involved in this scheme. The morning after our meeting, the FBI had set up surveillance at Hampton Regional Airport. Thanks to Katie's information, they knew to watch for the 2 women from Premium Communities Management Group, but they weren't sure who they were meeting. The detective had asked me to be available by phone in case they needed help identifying anyone from our neighborhood. Sarah Chen had positioned herself at the Daily Grind, our regular coffee shop, coordinating with Katie to monitor any suspicious conversations. The 2 Premium Communities women had stopped in for their usual morning coffee, completely unaware that their conversation was being carefully observed. "They're talking about meeting someone called the developer at Gate C4. Sarah texted me. They seem nervous, keeping their voices really low. The FBI agents at the airport were strategically positioned around Gate C4, dressed as travelers and airport staff. James O'Connor, who had been brought in as a legal consultant for the operation, was monitoring everything from a nearby command center. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the 2 women arrived at the gate. Through the FBI's surveillance, we could see them constantly checking their phones and looking around anxiously. Then something unexpected happened. Greg Wilson walked into the terminal. "Greg's here," I texted the detective, "but he's supposed to be cooperating with the investigation. What's going on?" Before anyone could respond, another familiar face appeared Richard Maxwell, the developer behind Golden Vista Estates. This was the same luxury development that Becky had been so desperate to impress, the one that had supposedly never heard of her. The FBI agents watched as Greg approached. The group, he looked nervous, clutching a thick envelope. Richard Maxwell greeted him like an old friend, which was strange, considering the development company had claimed no connection to our HOA situation. Thanks to the FBI's surveillance equipment, we could hear their conversation. What we learned was astounding. The property values are dropping just like you predicted, Greg was saying, handing over the envelope. 6 more houses listed below market value this week. Your investors can move whenever you're ready. Maxwell smiled, checking the contents of the envelope. Excellent. And the HOA regulations? All the documentation Becky prepared is still in place, Greg replied. Once your group buys in, you can push through any changes you want. The groundwork's all laid. One of the premium community's women spoke up. But what about the investigation? The FBI's asking questions about our consulting contracts. Maxwell waved dismissively. That's why we have layers of shell companies. Let them investigate premium communities. By the time they unravel anything, we'll be operating under new names. That's when everything happened at once. FBI agents moved in from all directions. Greg immediately raised his hands. Turns out, he'd been wearing a wire the whole time. The entire meeting had been a sting operation. Richard Maxwell tried to run, but didn't get far. The premium community's women were caught trying to delete data from their phones. Within minutes, all 3 were in custody, and the FBI was seizing phones, laptops, and documents. Back at the coffee shop, Sarah watched as 2 more FBI agents arrested Marcus Phillips, Maxwell's chief financial officer, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, monitoring the airport operation through his own sources. The investigation had just blown wide open. Maxwell wasn't just a developer. He was the mastermind behind dozens of real estate schemes across multiple states. The HOA fraud was just one part of a larger operation. James O'Connor called an emergency meeting at his office to brief everyone on what they'd discovered. The evidence from the airport's sting was damning. Maxwell's organization had been systematically targeting communities, using HOA takeovers as a way to manipulate property values and force homeowners out. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity, Eleanor Wright explained, reviewing the seized documents. They would identify neighborhoods with strong property values and healthy HOA reserves. Then they'd send in people like Becky to take over. The HOA implement harsh restrictions and drain the reserves. Frank Martinez picked up the explanation. Once the community was destabilized, their insider real estate agents would encourage panic selling. Maxwell's investment group would buy properties at deflated prices, wait for the neighborhood to recover, then sell at a huge profit. The FBI had found evidence linking Maxwell's organization to similar operations in 12 different states. Becky and Patricia weren't the masterminds we'd thought. They were just one team of many, working to execute Maxwell's larger plan. Greg's role in the sting operation had been crucial. After coming clean about his involvement, he had agreed to help the FBI gather evidence. His meeting at the airport had been carefully planned to get Maxwell and his associates to incriminate themselves on record. I still feel terrible about my part in all this, Greg admitted during the meeting. I really believed we were helping the neighborhood when Becky first recruited me. By the time I realized what was really happening, I felt trapped. Sarah Chen was already working on a comprehensive report of everything we'd uncovered. People need to know about this, she insisted. Other communities need to be warned about how these schemes work. The detective agreed. The FBI is preparing a national alert about this type of real estate fraud. Your documentation will help other neighborhoods recognize the warning signs. As we discussed the implications of these revelations, Tim Baker raised an important point. What about the people who already sold their homes under pressure? Some of our neighbors lost thousands of dollars selling to Maxwell's investment group. James O'Connor had good news on that front. The FBI is freezing all assets connected to Maxwell's organization. There will likely be a restitution fund for affected homeowners once the case is settled. But we still had one major loose end. Becky was still missing. The airport operation had revealed that she was supposed to meet Maxwell later that week in another state, preparing to start the scheme in a new community. That's when we got an unexpected break. Carol Anderson called me, her voice excited. "Jenny, you'll never believe who I just saw at the garden center 3 towns over. Becky." She was buying hair dye and some very suspicious-looking gardening supplies. The FBI moved quickly, but Becky had already left the garden center. However, she had used a credit card, her first mistake in days. They now had a trail to follow. Late that night, my phone rang. It was Officer Collins. "We got her," he said simply. "The FBI picked her up at a small motel just across the state line. She was planning to meet Maxwell tomorrow to get her next assignment." The news spread quickly through our neighborhood alert system. People stepped out onto their porches, celebrating the end of this chapter in our community's history. Sarah Chen organized an impromptu gathering on my front lawn, with neighbors bringing out chairs and refreshments. As we sat together that evening, sharing stories and processing everything that had happened, Carol Anderson made an observation that stuck with me. "You know what's remarkable?" she said, gently swaying on my porch swing. "They thought they could destroy our community by attacking the things that make it special, like this swing. Instead, they brought us closer together." The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of preliminary hearings. News of the multi-state HOA fraud scheme had attracted media attention, and reporters filled the hallways. James O'Connor had helped me prepare to testify, but nothing could have readied me for what we were about to learn. As I sat in the courtroom that morning, I noticed familiar faces from other communities. Robert Martinez from Riverside Gardens, Eleanor Wright with her detailed financial records, and representatives from at least a dozen other neighborhoods that had been targeted by Maxwell's organization. The federal prosecutor's opening statement laid out a conspiracy far more extensive than any of us had imagined. Maxwell's organization hadn't just been manipulating HOAs and property values. They had infiltrated local government offices, compromised real estate licensing boards, and even influenced zoning decisions. The defendants before you today, the prosecutor began, operated one of the most sophisticated real estate fraud schemes ever uncovered in this country. Through a network of shell companies, compromised HOA boards, and manipulated property values, they stole millions of dollars from hardworking homeowners across 12 states. Becky was the first to accept a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Maxwell and the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony painted a picture of calculated deception that had been refined over years of operation. Mr. Maxwell's organization had a playbook, she explained from the witness stand. We would identify neighborhoods with strong financials but minimal oversight. Patricia and I would move in, get elected to the HOA board, and start implementing what we called aesthetic enhancement protocols. It was all designed to give us control while making residents feel powerless. The prosecution presented evidence showing how Maxwell's team had systematically targeted communities. They had detailed profiles of each neighborhood, including financial records, demographic information, and what they called resistance potential, how likely residents were to fight back against HOA overreach. Eleanor Wright's testimony about the financial aspects was particularly damning. She demonstrated how the shell companies had been used to launder money through fake consulting contracts, with funds moving through multiple accounts before ending up in offshore holdings. The consulting fees were just the beginning, Eleanor explained. presenting her meticulously prepared financial analysis. The real profit came from manipulating property values. They would use HOA restrictions and hefty fines to pressure selected homeowners into selling below market value. Then Maxwell's investment groups would buy the properties through various front companies. Frank Martinez testified about how they had discovered the financial irregularities in our HOA accounts. His detailed records of Becky's unauthorized transactions helped establish the pattern of fraud that had been repeated in other communities. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah Chen showed me some surprising statistics she had compiled. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to her laptop screen. In every community they targeted, they focused on personal property features first. Things like porch swings, garden decorations, or unique architectural elements. They deliberately attacked anything that gave neighborhoods their individual character. The testimony of local officials from various jurisdictions revealed how deep the corruption went. Maxwell's organization had paid bribes to ensure their activities wouldn't face scrutiny. They had even managed to place sympathetic individuals on planning commissions and zoning boards. One former planning commissioner, now testifying under immunity, explained how the scheme worked at the municipal level. Maxwell's people would propose zoning changes that made their target neighborhoods less desirable. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments to traffic patterns or buffer requirements, enough to justify their claims about declining property values. Greg Wilson's testimony about his role in our neighborhood proved crucial. He provided detailed accounts of meetings where Maxwell and his associates had planned their strategy. They called it community standardization, but it was really about breaking down neighborhood resistance. The more they could make people feel powerless over their own properties, the easier it was to manipulate them. The Premium Communities Management Group women, facing serious charges themselves, also decided to cooperate. Their testimony revealed how the organization had created a network of fake property management companies, each designed to appear legitimate while funneling money back to Maxwell's central operation. "We were trained to use specific language," one of them testified. Terms like property value protection and community standards were chosen to sound reasonable while disguising the real intent. "We had scripts for handling resident complaints and strategies for isolating troublemakers." The most shocking testimony came from Marcus Phillips, Maxwell's former CFO. After accepting a plea deal, he revealed the true scope of the organization's activities. They hadn't just been stealing HOA funds and manipulating property values. They had been using the scheme to launder money for other criminal enterprises. "The real estate transactions were perfect for hiding illicit funds," Phillips explained. "Who questions it when property values fluctuate? We could move millions through these neighborhoods, and it all looked like normal market activity." During his testimony, Phillips shared documents showing how Maxwell's organization had planned to expand their operation. They had identified over 50 potential target communities across the country, with detailed plans for taking control of each one. James O'Connor was particularly interested in the legal implications of these revelations. "This case is going to change how HOAs are regulated," he predicted during a lunch break. The lack of oversight made this kind of fraud too easy. As the trial continued, we heard from more victims of the scheme. Homeowners from different states shared similar stories of how their communities had been systematically undermined. Many had lost significant amounts of money, forced to sell their homes under pressure from manipulated HOA regulations. One elderly couple's testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears. They had lived in their home for 40 years before Maxwell's organization targeted their neighborhood. Within 6 months, they were facing thousands of dollars in HOA fines over their garden decorations and front porch furniture. They eventually sold their home for far below market value, only to watch as it was quickly resold at a massive profit. The defense attorneys tried to portray Maxwell as a legitimate businessman who was unaware of his associates' illegal activities, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses painted a clear picture of his direct involvement in every aspect of the scheme. By the third week of the trial, the impact of the case was already being felt across the country. State legislators were proposing new regulations for HOAs, including stricter financial oversight and limits on their ability to impose aesthetic restrictions. Real estate organizations were implementing new safeguards against property value manipulation. Sarah Chen had been documenting everything for a planned book about the case. The really interesting part, she told me during a court recess, is how this all started with one person standing up to unreasonable HOA demands. Your refusal to remove that porch swing led to the unraveling of a multi-state criminal enterprise. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful. They showed a video compilation of affected neighborhoods, contrasting the vibrant communities that had existed before Maxwell's organization with the sterile, controlled environments they tried to create. This case is about more than stolen money or manipulated property values, the prosecutor concluded. It's about the systematic attempt to destroy the unique character of American neighborhoods for profit. The defendants didn't just steal funds. They tried to steal the very thing that makes communities special, their individuality. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. Maxwell and his top associates were found guilty on all counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Becky and Patricia received lighter sentences due to their cooperation, but they would still spend significant time in federal prison. As we left the courthouse after the verdict, I found myself surrounded by people from other communities that had been affected by the scheme. They all wanted to share their stories, and many had started initiatives to help their neighborhoods recover. "We're rebuilding our community garden," one woman told me, "the one they made us remove because it didn't meet their aesthetic standards. This time, we're making it bigger and better." The morning after the verdict, I woke up to an unusual sight. My neighbors had organized a surprise community spirit celebration, and every porch in sight had some kind of personal touch added to it. The Bakers had installed a beautiful porch swing similar to mine. The Chens had put up fairy lights and comfortable seating. Even Greg Wilson, still making amends for his earlier role in Becky's scheme, had added a handcrafted bench to his front porch. Frank Martinez called an emergency HOA meeting, but this one was different from any we'd had before. Instead of focusing on restrictions and rules, we discussed how to rebuild our community's financial strength while preserving the individual character that made our neighborhood special. "The first order of business," Frank announced, "is recovering our reserve funds. The FBI has frozen all of Maxwell's assets, and the court has ordered restitution to affected communities. But that process could take months or even years." That's when something remarkable happened. Pete and Carol Anderson stood up with a proposal. "We've been talking with our neighbors," Carol began, "and we've come up with a community investment plan. Instead of waiting for the restitution process, we can pool our resources to rebuild our reserves immediately." Their plan was innovative. Residents who could afford to would make voluntary contributions to a special reconstruction fund, essentially providing an interest-free loan to the HOA. As restitution payments came in, these loans would be repaid. Those who couldn't contribute financially could offer their time and skills to community improvement projects. Sarah Chen had already created a digital platform to coordinate these efforts. "Think of it as a community skills exchange," she explained, demonstrating the website. We have neighbors who are accountants, lawyers, contractors, gardeners. Instead of hiring outside services, we can use our own talents to rebuild. The idea caught on quickly. Tim Baker and his engineering colleagues volunteered to conduct a comprehensive infrastructure assessment. Maria Rodriguez's landscaping company offered discounted services for common areas. Emily Watson provided free real estate consultations to help homeowners who had been pressured into undervaluing their properties. James O'Connor was working with HOA associations nationwide to develop new protection protocols. What happened here exposed serious vulnerabilities in how HOAs operate, he explained during a community workshop. We need to create systems that preserve community character while preventing abuse. The changes we implemented became a model for other neighborhoods. We established a rotating board membership system to prevent any one person or group from maintaining long-term control. Financial decisions above a certain threshold required resident approval through a secure online voting system Sarah had developed. Our story had caught the attention of national media, and reporters frequently visited to document our recovery process. One morning, a major news network set up cameras on my front lawn to interview various community members about our experience. The porch swing that started it all has become a symbol of community resistance to standardization, the reporter noted, as neighbors gathered to share their stories. Each person had a unique perspective on how the experience had changed their view of community involvement. Eleanor Wright, the retired forensic accountant, had started offering free financial literacy workshops for HOA board members across the state. Knowledge is power, she explained during one session. When residents understand their community's finances, it's much harder for anyone to exploit them. The ripple effects of our case were being felt nationwide. State legislators were contacting James O'Connor for input on new HOA regulations. Real estate organizations were implementing enhanced screening procedures for property management companies. Community associations were revising their bylaws to protect against the tactics Maxwell's organization had used. Robert Martinez from Riverside Gardens became a regular visitor, coordinating with other affected communities to share recovery strategies. What happened to us was terrible, he said during one meeting, but look at the positive changes it sparked. Communities are coming together, neighbors are helping neighbors, and people are rediscovering what makes their neighborhoods special. One of the most significant changes was in how communities approached aesthetic guidelines. Instead of rigid standardization, the focus shifted to maintaining safety and structural integrity while celebrating individual expression. Our HOA created what we called character preservation guidelines, basic standards that ensured proper maintenance, while protecting homeowners' right to personalize their properties. The transformation was visible throughout our neighborhood. Front porches that had been stark and uninviting under Becky's restrictions now featured comfortable seating areas, plants, and personal touches that reflected each family's style. Children played freely in front yards, and neighbors gathered spontaneously for evening conversations. Sarah Chen's community engagement platform had evolved into a full-fledged neighborhood support network. Residents used it to coordinate everything from babysitting exchanges to tool lending to meal trains for families going through difficult times. The platform was so successful that other communities began adopting similar systems. Greg Wilson, continuing his journey of redemption, had become an advocate for HOA reform. He traveled to other communities, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale about how good intentions could be manipulated by skilled fraudsters. I thought I was protecting property values, he would tell audiences, but I was actually helping destroy what makes communities valuable in the first place, their unique character and the connections between neighbors. The recovery process wasn't always smooth. Some residents who had lost money through forced sales were still waiting for restitution. Others struggled to undo unnecessary modifications they'd made to comply with Becky's restrictions. But the community spirit that had emerged from the crisis helped carry us through these challenges. One evening, about 6 months after the trial, we organized a neighborhood-wide porch gathering. Every front porch became a station in a progressive dinner party, with residents moving from house to house, sharing food and stories. The event celebrated both our recovery and the connections we'd built through this experience. As I sat on my porch swing that night, watching neighbors chat and children play, Carol Anderson joined me with a contented smile. "You know what's remarkable," she said. "Becky and Maxwell thought they could break our community by attacking its character. Instead, they helped us discover just how strong that character really is." The FBI's asset recovery team had begun the process of liquidating Maxwell's holdings, and the first restitution payments were starting to reach affected communities. But the financial recovery was only part of the story. The real transformation was in how people viewed their role in their communities. Diana Cooper, who had helped expose Becky's schemes, had started a consulting firm specializing in HOA transparency and resident engagement. "The old model of HOAs as rule enforcers is outdated," she explained during a workshop. "They should be facilitators of community cooperation, not barriers to individual expression." The changes weren't limited to residential communities. Commercial property associations and business improvement districts were also adopting our transparency and engagement models. The idea that community character was an asset to be protected rather than a problem to be controlled was spreading. Our experience had even influenced urban planning discussions. Several cities revised their zoning codes to better protect neighborhood character while maintaining property values. The false dichotomy between standardization and value preservation that Maxwell's organization had exploited was being challenged nationwide. Throughout this transformation, my porch swing remained a symbol of resistance to arbitrary control. People would stop by to take pictures, share stories, or just enjoy a moment of quiet contemplation. The simple act of standing up for something, personal and meaningful, had sparked a movement toward more authentic, connected communities. 1 year after the trial, our neighborhood hosted a national conference on community empowerment. Representatives from over 200 HOAs came to learn about our experience and the positive changes it had inspired. The conference was held in our community center, which had been renovated through our neighborhood skills exchange program. Sarah Chen kicked off the event with a presentation showing the remarkable transformation our community had undergone. Property values had not only recovered, but were now among the highest in the region. More importantly, resident satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of community engagement and belonging. "What we discovered," Sarah explained to the packed room, "was that strong communities aren't built through standardization and control. They're built through connection, individual expression, and mutual support." Frank Martinez presented our new financial oversight system, which had become a model for HOAs nationwide. The transparent digital platform we'd developed made it impossible for anyone to manipulate community funds without detection. Every transaction was visible to residents in real time, with multiple layers of verification required for major expenditures. James O'Connor led a session on legal protections for community character. He shared how our experience had influenced new state laws protecting homeowners' rights while maintaining reasonable community standards. "The key," he emphasized, "is distinguishing between necessary maintenance requirements and arbitrary aesthetic controls." The conference included tours of our neighborhood, and my porch swing became an unexpected highlight. People wanted to see where the resistance to Maxwell's organization had started. I spent hours sharing our story with visitors, watching their faces light up as they realized how standing up for something small could lead to meaningful change. Eleanor Wright's financial literacy workshop was particularly popular. She had developed a comprehensive program helping HOA boards and residents understand their community finances. Financial transparency isn't just about preventing fraud, she explained. It's about empowering residents to actively participate in their community's development. Greg Wilson's session on recognizing and resisting fraudulent schemes drew a huge crowd. His first-hand experience as someone who had been manipulated by Maxwell's organization provided valuable insights. They prey on our good intentions, he warned. The desire to protect our communities can be used against us if we're not vigilant. During the conference lunch break, we received unexpected news. The FBI's asset recovery team had successfully traced and frozen another set of Maxwell's hidden accounts. The additional funds meant full restitution for all affected communities would be possible much sooner than expected. But the financial recovery was just part of the story. Communities across the country were reporting positive changes inspired by our experience. Neighborhoods that had once been controlled by rigid restrictions were transforming into vibrant, individualistic spaces where residents felt free to express themselves while still maintaining high standards of care and maintenance. Diana Cooper presented data showing how communities that adopted our transparency and engagement model had significantly lower rates of resident turnover and higher levels of voluntary community participation. When people feel connected to their neighborhoods, she noted, they naturally want to contribute to their maintenance and improvement. The skills exchange platform Sarah had developed had evolved into a national network. Communities could now share resources and expertise across state lines, helping each other implement positive changes and resist fraudulent schemes. Robert Martinez brought news that Riverside Gardens, one of the first communities targeted by Maxwell's organization, had completely reinvented itself. Their new community guidelines emphasized personal expression while maintaining basic standards through resident cooperation rather than strict enforcement. Tim Baker's engineering team had created an open-source infrastructure assessment tool that communities could use to evaluate and maintain their facilities. Proper maintenance doesn't require controlling every aspect of how people live, he explained. It's about focusing on what really matters for safety and sustainability. Maria Rodriguez shared how her landscaping company had helped develop new guidelines that balanced environmental responsibility with personal expression. We proved that you can have beautiful, well-maintained neighborhoods without forcing everyone to plant the same flowers in the same patterns. The conference's final day featured a community celebration that spread across our entire neighborhood. Every porch became a gathering space, decorated to reflect each family's personality, while contributing to the overall warmth and welcome of our streets. The sight of hundreds of visitors moving from porch to porch, sharing stories and ideas, was unforgettable. As the sun set on the final evening, Carol Anderson hosted a special ceremony on her porch. 1 year ago, she reminded everyone, we were fighting to save our community's character. Today, we're showing the world that strong communities are built on celebrating our differences, not hiding them. The impact of our story continued to spread. Urban planning schools began using our case as a study in how community character affects property values. Real estate organizations developed new metrics that recognized the positive impact of personal expression on neighborhood desirability. The porch swing movement, as some called it, inspired a national conversation about the true meaning of community standards. People began to question the assumption that uniformity was necessary for maintaining property values. Studies showed that neighborhoods allowing personal expression often perform better in the real estate market than those with rigid restrictions. Pete Anderson, who had meticulously documented our community's transformation, published his findings in a professional journal. His data showed that resident-driven community standards, focused on maintenance and safety rather than aesthetic control, resulted in more stable property values and stronger community bonds. Emily Watson reported that home buyers were specifically seeking out communities that had adopted our model of resident empowerment. People want to live in neighborhoods where they can be themselves while still being part of something larger, she explained. They're tired of cookie-cutter communities. The porch swing that started it all became something of a local landmark. Visitors would stop by to take pictures and hear the story. Some even brought pieces of their own porch furniture to show how they were reclaiming their community's character. Sarah Chen's book about our experience became a bestseller, inspiring more communities to examine their HOA practices and implement positive changes. The royalties went into a foundation supporting community empowerment initiatives across the country. One particularly touching moment came when an elderly couple who had lost their home to Maxwell's scheme in another state visited our neighborhood. They had received their restitution payment and wanted to thank us for helping expose the fraud. Seeing all these porches, all this life and personality, the wife said tearfully, it reminds us of what our neighborhood used to be like. And now, thanks to what started here, communities everywhere are remembering what really matters. As our story spread, we received messages from people around the world sharing similar experiences and asking for advice on building stronger communities. The movement had grown far beyond anything we could have imagined when I first refused to remove my porch swing. Looking back now, it's amazing to think how one small act of resistance led to such widespread positive change. My grandmother's wisdom about standing up for what matters, even in small ways, proved more powerful than I could have imagined. Today, my porch swing still hangs proudly, but it's no longer just my personal reminder of childhood memories. It's become a symbol of how communities can stand together against those who would try to control them through fear and false promises. Every evening, as I sit on my swing watching neighbors chat on their porches and children play freely in front, yards decorated with personal touches, I'm reminded that true community value isn't measured in uniformity or control. It's measured in the connections we build, the support we offer each other, and the freedom to express what makes each of us unique while still being part of something larger. If you enjoyed this story about standing up for what's right and building stronger communities, you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Up next, you've got 2 more incredible stories waiting for you right on your screen. They're all about people who stood up against unfair treatment and made a real difference in their communities. Just click to check them out. You won't regret it. Remember to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to catch more stories about everyday people making extraordinary changes in their communities. Drop a comment below, sharing your own experiences with building stronger neighborhoods. I'd love to hear how you're making a difference where you live. Thank you all for following this journey from start to finish. Together, we're showing that real community strength comes from celebrating our differences, not hiding them. See you in the next video.